So welcome to the latest episode of Contextual 101, which is brought by me, Amelia Kag, Global Head of Growth at Seedtag. In this episode, we'll be talking about the topics of brand safety and brand suitability. And we have a guest today on our podcast who is Wayne Blodwell. So Wayne and I have been friends for many years now. We've known each other a long time in the UK media industry. But yes, very happy and excited to have you here, Wayne. So thank you for joining us.
No, thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and you obviously have your own podcast as well, so you are an expert now in filming these things. So let's kick off on the topic of brand safety and brand suitability. You know, it's something that we're all well aware of in our industry. But before we launch onto that, can you tell us a little bit about your role, what you do, and the background to how you got here?
Yeah, sure. So I'm the founder and CEO of the Programmatic Advisory. We're a strategic consultancy firm, and we work with major advertisers to further what they do in programmatic. We started 5 years next month ago, which has sort of flown by. We started out in the UK, and then in 2019 we acquired a consultancy in the US, and then I moved over last year to grow that. And we work with advertisers in four areas, like four specialisms: data, tech, operations, and supply. This is a new one we just added. So we help brands across those four pillars of programmatic. And we advise in brand safety and brand suitability within supply particularly. Excited to talk about the topic because my background was always hands-on trader, DSPs and platforms, and have been at the coalface of brand safety issues. Good to talk about today.
Yes, no, I knew that you'd be an expert in this topic as well. I was glad to have you as my guest. Okay, so let's get to it. So first of all, how would you define brand safety and how would you define brand suitability?
Yeah, it's interesting because brand safety was the kind of initial words for how you keep your brand logos from not targeting invalid traffic or fraud or appearing against poor content. And it kind of was as simple as that in theory. And then brand suitability is a bit more of a recent, in the last couple of years, where it's less about just not poor content, not invalid traffic. It's also trying to find proactively locations that you want your brand to appear and where you think it's more suitable and where you want to invest. And in both cases, there is a spectrum. You've obviously got parts of the internet which is exceptionally poor content, and no one would argue with that, and you never want your ads to appear against. And you've got parts of the internet which is of exceptionally high quality content, which you're more than happy to have your ads appear against. There's this big chunk in the middle where there's grey areas, like is it negative content about a football player, or is it talking about like a major travel accident, or there's a tone of voice, there's topics. Sometimes you don't want your ad to appear on a page with a competitive advertiser, or a page with 10 ads on it. So there's a big spectrum, and I think suitability really is working out where on that spectrum do you want to land, and where do you, as an advertiser or as a buyer, where do you want your dollars to go? Whereas brand safety is, let's just avoid non-human traffic and like the really bad parts of the internet.
Something just came to my mind actually. Like, where did brand suitability derive from? Like, as you say, it's a recent terminology, and it's only been around for the last couple of years. Like, in your opinion, what gave birth to the idea of brand suitability?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly, but maybe a couple of years ago, there was the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, which was born out of the WFA, the World Federation of Advertisers, all the acronyms there. And that's the WFA represents a lot of major advertisers worldwide. So P&G, Unilever's, Coca-Cola, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think just collectively they're starting to think about, as big advertisers who spend a lot of money, where's that money actually going? Like, how are we funding journalism, content creation? What's the approach to social media and Facebook and YouTube, etc. And I think when these advertisers started to think about that in particular, that's where you start to realize that it is actually quite nuanced, and it's also really important because they spend a truckload of money, and it should work for their brand and their KPIs and goals, but B, it should be going to the right places, which make the internet a very positive experience for consumers. So I mean, I'm sort of guessing, but I think that's where it came from. And then since then, we've seen buyers, so the agencies and managed services and tech and all the layers in between, plus advertisers sort of lean into what is suitable for our brands and how we want to invest our budgets.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the most obvious example is now it's COVID, right? So are we supposed to exclude every single page that references COVID? We can't, because it's so prevalent in the editorial that we read online nowadays. And if you're a travel brand, for instance, it's actually really important to appear against content related to COVID to reinforce your principle that you are, a safe brand. I'm sure when Eurostar and other airlines truly are up and running, they're going to have to put out a lot of messaging about how they are hygienic, they're able to transport their guests and their passengers safely and so forth, but you need to be appearing within the right areas, and therefore you can't be excluding these topics now because it's so part of it.
Yeah, entirely. And you just need to take a more tailored approach to the media you're buying, as opposed to really blanket based like default technology potentially, or like exclusion lists. There's just like excluding one website at domain level in its entirety might not be the best approach, because that might be a newspaper and an online publication which represents news, and actually they write about really varied topics, and similar with keywords. Like, we know that certain keywords can be applied in all sorts of different contexts, positively and negatively. So, taking a more tailored approach is really, really important. Otherwise, one, your ads might not reach the right people, and two, you're just cutting off, funding really important things.
Yeah, completely agree. I mean, you touched on it in terms of what you just said, but how would you advise your current clients on approaching brand suitability, or taking a brand suitability approach?
Yeah, and this is my classic consultant answer, because it's always it depends, because I don't think there's one way you should approach brand suitability for every advertiser in every market across the world, because their approach to buying media is unique based on their KPIs or formats or channels. And two, what might be suitable for them as a business and their goals is very different from one to another. So we'll always, when we talk to clients about brand safety and suitability, it's always, let's talk about what do you want to do as a brand, what's important to you, what are you trying to achieve out of media, what about your wider business goals around the importance of what you're doing socially, like corporate social responsibility. And also, but really keen to say, there isn't a foolproof way. So there isn't this, a 100% method, which means you'll never appear against something which might be, or a little bit of fraud or one or two misplacements, because the internet is so vast and there's so much content that's being created all the time. So we always try to just work with clients to work out what's their exact approach and and then hopefully help them implement it alongside their agencies in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. Absolutely, it's not going to be a one size fits all approach. In your opinion, what are the negatives or positives of a brand employing a brand suitability approach? What's in it for them?
Yeah, I think the positives are, where your dollars are going. You become comfortable in your approach. So if there was some bad press or somebody senior in the business was to question how you're investing, you have an approach. Whereas, I'd say like 3 to 5 years ago, well, even now, to be honest, many brands don't have a documented approach to suitability. It's heavily outsourced. I remember about 4 or 5 years, no, more than that, 6 years ago when I was at an agency, we were called out in a major newspaper in the UK for one of our clients' logos appearing on some poor content. And the client, we were using a third-party verification tool at the time, and we had a very strict approach to the exchanges we bought from, and we had an inclusion list, but it still slipped through the net. But the brand managers at that time didn't really have a great way of answering the questions when the CEO starts asking, why is our logo in page 24 of The Sun, where showing that we've been appearing against poor content. So I think a positive would be, if you have an approach, it's documented, where it might fall through the gaps and what you're doing. I think the negatives, and there aren't really many, but there's probably only one, is the stricter you make your suitability approach, the less media you buy. And that means it can be difficult to optimize. This is in theory. So say you've got 1,000 impressions and you decide there's only 10 you want to buy. Well, that means your campaign is going to have to bid higher or work harder on those 10 impressions to achieve your KPIs. I say in theory because of that 1,000, there's going to be a ton of stuff you don't want to buy anyway, which isn't viewable or is against negative content and stuff. But generally, if you start to, reduce supply, you have to your optimization sort of capability gets a little bit stretched. So that's the only downside. I mean, that's literally the only downside I can think about to having a strict suitability approach. There's a bit of a trade-off. But in general, the positives just far outweigh by having more comfort and control over how you're investing than the negatives, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's always the balance I think we're facing. Marketers wanting to achieve their KPIs. So in video, it could be like 100% viewability and 80% view-through rate and X% reach on target. It's just, and then it's the white list and it's the exclusion list. It's like, okay, at some point something's got to give, and we have to trust that, the delivery, the publishers you're working with, the vendors you're working with, the technology is going to be robust enough to support your objectives and your goals. So, yeah, I think that is a good example. Okay, so flipping the coin, what is the effect of using a brand suitability approach for publishers?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I have sympathy for publishers because when a blanket approach is implemented, they can, where there's no nuance, they can fall a bit unfairly and they don't get any demand and revenue going through. But at the same time, I do really think it's the prerogative of the buyer to decide what they want to buy and how they want to buy. So when publishers do complain, I understand because it's lost revenue. But on the flip side, I do think it's down to the buyer. But how it impacts publishers, I guess, would be if a buyer is using like an inclusion list approach and that publisher isn't on that inclusion list, they don't see any revenue. Maybe if the buyer is implementing a kind of a negative keyword strategy where they just exclude content which has certain keywords, as you mentioned earlier, there's nuance to how keywords are applied. And sometimes if a buyer is using a third-party verification tool, those tools will have different approaches to what they deem as appropriate or not appropriate. So the publisher really, there's multiple ways where basically demand doesn't reach them and they don't make revenue from that demand because it's basically being blocked or even like before, no bid at all. So that's how I think publishers get impacted. And yeah, as I said, some sympathy, where particularly where these blanket approaches being applied. But at the same time, it's, part of the publisher's role, I think, is to educate the buyers into, how maybe better to approach brand safety and suitability with them. So really, but really it's on the buyer to make better decisions over what they buy.
Yeah, no, I think you're right there. And this is going to be a tough question, by the way. So I do warn you. So it's going to be a hard yes or no, perhaps, black and white response. But in your opinion, is one better than the other?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think it's about one or the other per se. I think it's, about being if I was a brand, I wouldn't go, I need a brand safety approach and a brand suitability approach. I just need an approach to how I buy media and what sits comfortably with me. So I think for brands and advertisers, because it is their logos, it is their responsibility, I think, to know where they're being placed and where their money goes. It's working with their agency to really understand how they're buying media and just being very proactive into understanding that, because they need to know where budgets and logos appear. So I don't think it's about one being better than another. I think it's just taking a very holistic approach to how should you buy media and how do you apply the different things in brand safety and the different things in brand suitability.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you understand from your agency days now in your consultancy business that each client will always employ a different approach. It's not a case of one is better than the other. And you just touched on it just now, actually, but who do you think is responsible for ensuring that a brand safety or brand suitability approach is in place? Like, is it the marketer? Is it the brand? Is it the agency, the publisher? Is it a combination of the three?
Yeah, it's so a couple of years ago, I said it was the marketer, and there was this big front page of the Times in the UK around brands who've been funding terrorist content on YouTube inadvertently. And I said that the marketers should take more control over where the logos appear. And then Mark Ritson, a well-recognized marketing professor, wrote an article and called me an idiot within it because he thought the approach should be on the agencies. And it's entirely down to them. That's what the brands pay them to do. Thankfully, Keith Weed, who was then the CMO at Unilever, he came out like 3 weeks later saying it's on them and their brands to better know where their budgets are going. So I really think it's the marketer. Like, I really wholeheartedly believe that if you are in marketing, you should be very aware of where your budgets are going, where your logos are going. I don't think you should outsource that to an agency. However, in practice, the agency are the ones implementing it. So the agency should be working with the brand to better understand, how to do it. And then, the agency should be the ones who hold the relationships, more proactively with publishers and ad exchanges and DSPs and, partners, et cetera, et cetera. But really, I think that the marketer, they have a lot on. It's always what the feedback is. The marketer's so busy all the time. But I do think one of their core responsibilities should be to better understand where their budgets go. And I definitely would say in the last couple of years, we have seen them lean in to that, definitely. I still think there's a bit of a way to go for some of them. But I definitely think it's primarily on the marketer, but working in conjunction with their agency and their partners.
Yeah, that was actually going to be one of my questions, based on your background and experience, both agency side and now, how of the brands and marketers that you're working with and speaking to, how much are they aware about where the dollars are running, where the pounds are running, and are they actually that clued up about the brand safety and brand suitability approaches and measures that they should and can be taking? What you're saying, it doesn't sound like that's a strength, and it is going in that direction. It should be that direction, but
it's probably 50-50 in all honesty, where 50% have a very good understanding of where their budgets and ads are going, and 50% who might know to some extent, but probably are like, wow, that's my role of my agency. And yeah, there isn't really any hard or fast rule as to who's in the 50% either side. It just probably those who have been stung before are probably in the ones who now know, have taken a proactive approach, who've been in newspapers and called out on Twitter, etc. But there's definitely a lot of brands who, really do outsource it, don't think it's their responsibility, and would rely on the agency. And it's. Yeah, well, I don't know why those things, where a lot of it's down between the relationship between the brand and their partners versus what they do. But yeah, as I say, I think that 50% who currently lean in and have some control over it should be getting more towards like 100% eventually. I think it's really important that they know that.
Yeah, absolutely. And considering that you launched your business first in the UK and now you're based in the US, are you seeing there being many differences in approaches in the two markets? And if so, what are those?
There are. And I think it's, basically the UK is more conservative, which I don't think would be too surprising based on if you know people from the UK and from the US. And generally, like industry-wide surveys show that you have less risk of misplacement and fraud in the UK. When you're buying, as opposed to in the US and other markets. And that's in particular to programmatic in mobile and desktop video. I think there's two reasons why the UK is a bit more conservative. One, culture. We've had some really well recognized and known newspapers like call out brands. And when that happens, that no one wants that to happen again. And then two, the scale of buying in the US is so much bigger. I mean, there's just clearly more people, more ad impressions, and I think managing a suitability approach manually is just more challenging because of the scale. So, for example, if you wanted to build an inclusion list in the UK, probably not amazingly difficult to do. If you wanted to build one in the US, it's much harder because there's just more content, more pages, more people. There definitely is. So the US is by no means like laissez-faire and like just ignoring it. But the UK, I think, just through the culture, through the call-outs in newspapers, through the reduced scale, take a more proactive approach to brand suitability and safety compared to the US.
So interesting, isn't it? When you work in one market, then you evolve to another, and you see the different approaches to media, to digital buying, planning, execution, so forth. But you could literally do a whole podcast on that, because I found it so fascinating coming from the UK to the US, and like pros and cons everywhere. But when you start to compare, it is interesting just generally how brands approach media here in the US. It's different to how they approach it in the UK. And yeah, as I say, I think the suitability is just more stringent in the UK for sure. Yeah, absolutely. And based on what you're doing and what you're seeing in terms of the client conversations that you're having, the types of people that you're speaking to, are there any smart approaches or technology that are being employed that are leading the way forward at the moment in the industry?
Yeah, I think there's of all the tech vendors, there's all some different methodologies. So I wouldn't say necessarily, 1, 2, 3, however many necessarily leading the way. I think, but they're all a bit different. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important that if you do use these technology partners, you understand how their approach to it. Basically, like all the things we've spoken around like the semantics within language, how they block at different levels, how they categorize content, etc., etc. Just understand it and then make your own decisions. But I think what is important is third-party accreditation. And there's kind of three different ones or methods which we've sort of seen. So one I mentioned earlier was the Global Alliance for Responsible Media. And that basically sets out a charter that advertisers subscribe to, and they work with large publishers and partners to try to implement that charter. So, for example, they work with Facebook, and Facebook took down 22 million pieces of content which contained hate speech last year in Q3, and then that went up to 27 million pieces of hate speech in Q4. And so GARM worked closely with the likes of Facebook to make sure that they're proactively, working with partners. You also have the IAB gold standards, and that's more for suppliers. So suppliers can follow the kind of the accreditation process to show that they are, doing all the right things when it comes to how they sell ads or represent ads. And you have brands like Asda, Tesco, Coca-Cola, who try to prioritize suppliers who use the IAB gold standard. So that's a really good initiative. And then MRC, the Media Ratings Council, they run a thorough accreditation process. I don't actually know how thorough, but there is an accreditation process. Yes. And YouTube became MRC accredited in February this year. Nice. And so, that means that when you have these accreditations in place, there's just a bit more confidence in what you're buying. So I think that's the smart approaches are just good accreditation standards from industry bodies to validate. And then, from the technology layers, there's lots of good stuff going on and lots of interesting and smart ways that tech is recognizing good and bad and positive and negative content, but leaning into it to understand how they're doing that. I think that's what's important. And then, put the responsibility on yourself as a buyer, as a seller, to, know what's going on.
Absolutely. I completely agree with all the points that you made there. And it's something that you touched on briefly, which was the use of semantics. And it was something that I wanted to bring up because obviously you know that we at Seedtag are a contextual solution. Do you agree, or do you see contextual as a solution that adequately supports brand suitability, through the use of understanding the nuances of the page, the context, the sentiment, and so forth?
Yeah, definitely. And that's not just because I'm on the Seedtag podcast, but just like generally when we talk to advertisers, if they're going to put their ads against content and the content's like really negative, or it's like maybe overly controversial, or maybe it's politically leaning one way over another, or whatever it might be, you have to, knowing the nuance of that page and the language on it, it's really important for how your brand is then going to be, thought about when someone looks at your ad. And I do think sometimes we lose that sense a bit in digital, like in print and TV, that's well known. You put your ads against certain publications and magazines and certain TV content because there's affiliation between how people are feeling when they're reading and viewing it. In digital, we just kind of forgot that, and people just sort of thought, well, it's just an ad impression. But actually, the mindsets the user might be in when they're reading that content, and then when they see your ad, that will have some sort of, recall effect. So, yeah, I think using tools to manage all that nuance around language across publishers is impossible to do manually. So having tools and partners who can help you with that, I think is super important.
Yeah, well, you're preaching to converted on my side, so nothing else needs to be said there. Okay, moving on to my last and final question. Do you have any final predictions or pearls of wisdom for what's next?
Yeah, I think generally, hopefully, maybe I've just reiterated the point quite a lot, but like it is important, I think, that brands lean into where the money goes, because ultimately, like, as an advertiser, you advertise to generate some sort of business effect, whether that's a brand recall, online sales, the 100,000 metrics there might be or whatever. But advertising in general can be used as a force for good. And, there's $650 billion globally in ads. Half that's in digital. That's a ton of money. And that money should be making its way towards good actors, good publishers, good partners. And that only really happens when brands lean in and understand that. I think just waiting for one approach to how all ads are bought online is just never going to happen. There's too much nuance. So I really think that my prediction would be brands from that 50-50 split of who cares and who doesn't, it increases in how many brands care, increases in how many brands lean into how they approach safety and suitability. And I think that's only a good thing for the future of the ad-funded internet.
Wise words indeed. Well, I could listen to you all day.
Thanks, Mills.
Okay, well, I think that's all we have time for, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for appearing on this podcast. I think it's definitely a lot of topics that we could be discussing, so keep posted. And to anyone listening, or everyone listening, I should be saying, I hope you found that particularly interesting, and feel free to vote for us. Thank you.